Imagine a university so respected that students walked for months across mountains and rivers just to get in. A university with over 100 professors and more than 1,000 students, at a time when most of the world couldn't even read. A university that trained the scholars who would later spread Buddhism across Tibet, Nepal, and half of Asia. For 400 years, this university stood as one of the greatest centers of human knowledge on Earth. And then almost overnight it vanished, burned, destroyed, erased. This is the story of Vikramashila University and the mystery of how one of history's greatest centers of learning disappeared in a single, brutal moment. Let's go back to the late 8th century. The Pala Emperor Dharmapala, the same king who built an empire that rivaled Rome, decided India needed something extraordinary. At the time, Nalanda University already existed and it was famous. But Dharmapala believed the quality of scholarship there was starting to decline. So he built something new, Vikramashila, situated on a hill overlooking the Ganges River in what is now Bihar, India. This wasn't just a school. It was a massive academic city. The university had 6 major colleges, surrounded by 108 monasteries, and a grand central hall called Vijayan Bhawan, literally, the Hall of Knowledge. Entire complex was connected by 6 gates, each one guarded by a senior scholar who would test incoming students before they were allowed to enter. Think about that. You couldn't just enroll. You had to prove you were ready. Here's what made Vikramashila truly remarkable. It wasn't just an Indian university. It was an international one. Students and monks traveled from Tibet, Nepal, China, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. Some of them walked for months through dangerous mountain passes just to study there. The university specialized in something called Tantric Buddhism, advanced philosophical and spiritual studies that weren't taught anywhere else in the world at that level. The head of the university held a title called Kulpati, elected by the community of scholars themselves. This was, in many ways, more democratic than most universities in Europe at the same point in history. And here's the detail that connects everything together. Many of the scholars trained at Vikramashila later traveled to Tibet, and there a huge reason Tibet became a Buddhist nation. The most famous of these scholars was a monk named Atisha, who left Vikramashila and reshaped Tibetan Buddhism forever. If you've ever heard of the Dalai Lama or Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, some of its roots trace directly back to this university. Now here's where the story turns dark. By the late 1100s, the political landscape of northern India was changing rapidly. The Pala Empire, which had protected and funded Vikramashila for 400 years, had already fallen, and a new power was rising, the Delhi Sultanate, led by Turkic conquerors pushing into northern India. Around 1193 AD, a military commander named Bakhtiyar killed forces into Bihar. According to the most widely repeated historical accounts, his army arrived at the university complex. Some accounts suggest Khilji's forces mistook the university for a military fortress, since it was a massive walled complex on a hill. What happened next depends on which source you read. The most common version of the story says the library was burned. Thousands of manuscripts and possibly millions were destroyed. Monks and scholars were killed. Tibetan historical records, written by a monk historian named Taranatha centuries later, describe the destruction in devastating detail. However, and this is important for you to know, modern historians have pointed out something significant. There is no surviving eyewitness account from the time itself that confirms exactly what happened, or why. Most of what we know comes from accounts written decades or centuries after the events. Some historians believe the destruction was a deliberate religious and military act. Others believe it may have been a smaller, opportunistic raid that grew into legend over the centuries. What we know for certain is this. By the early 1200s, Vikramashila University had stopped functioning. A center of learning that had survived for 400 years was gone within a matter of years. So why don't we have clear records? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The very people who could have documented exactly what happened, the monks, the scholars, the librarians, were either killed or scattered. The institution that recorded history was the institution that got destroyed. It's like trying to understand what happened to a library by asking the books that burned inside it. This is actually a recurring tragedy in history. When the Library of Alexandria in Egypt declined and was lost, historians still argue about exactly how and when it happened. The same uncertainty surrounds Vikramashila. We know the result. The university disappeared. We're still piecing together the exact how. But here's something beautiful in all this darkness. Not everything was lost. Because Vikramashila had spent centuries sending scholars to Tibet, many Buddhist texts had already been translated and copied into Tibetan long before the destruction happened. So even though the original Sanskrit manuscripts burned in India, copies survived in Tibetan monasteries thousands of miles away. Centuries later, a scholar named Rahul Sankrityayan traveled to Tibet and brought many of these texts back to India, texts that had been thought lost forever. In a strange way, Vikramashila's knowledge survived because it had shared itself so widely. The university that welcomed the world was saved in part by the world it had taught. Today, if you visit Bihar, India, you can walk through the ruins of Vikramashila. Archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of the great stupa, the monastery walls, and parts of what was once Vijayan Bhawan, the Hall of Knowledge. It's quiet now. Grass grows where scholars once debated philosophy in 6 different languages, but the ideas that came out of this place, they didn't disappear. They live on in Tibetan Buddhism, in Nepalese monasteries, in museums that hold Pala-era manuscripts, and in the millions of people whose spiritual tradition traces back to scholars who stood in a hill in Bihar over 1,000 years ago. A building can be burned, a library can be destroyed, but knowledge, once it spreads far enough, becomes almost impossible to fully erase. Vikramashila taught the world that lesson twice, once when it was built, and once again when it fell. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure you subscribe, because we're going to keep digging up history that almost disappeared. I'm Jiten. This is Jiten Scrolls. See you in the next one.